So, hi, I'm Susan Adams. I'm a consultant clinical psychologist and I work in the dementia and frailty service area. And for the past 18 months, I've also been the chair of PPAC, which is the Psychological Professions Advisory Council Committee. And that's how I became involved in this work. So we've been working with some funding that's been allocated from Health Education England to increase the diversity amongst the clinical psychology workforce. And for a long time, the clinical psychology workforce has not been very diverse, and probably people who are working in our trust may have actually experienced that themselves. There's many women, and there aren't many people from a Black or minority ethnic background, and partly some of that has been caused by the very competitive nature of getting onto clinical psychology training. So to train as a clinical psychologist, you firstly need to be able to do your first degree in psychology. And then it's very common for you to spend several years gaining clinical experience before you are accepted onto a doctorate level training, which is another 3 years at university for your clinical training. And it's this gap in acquiring clinical experience that people can find it really difficult to break into the field and gain the best kinds of clinical experience, which help them showcase their skills at a doctorate interview training. To such an extent that many people, and it was becoming commonplace, that people were having to work for free. So they were needing to volunteer, and by volunteering I mean really substantial volunteering, several months full-time free work, to get clinical experience so that they could then get something like an assistant psychologist post, which would enable them to gain further clinical experience. And what was being recognised was not everybody can work for free. Some people need to be paid for a living. They've got bills of their own, and that was becoming a real exclusionary barrier for people of all backgrounds and to have a representative workforce, really. So psychologists have got a tradition of trying to evidence their practice and use evidence-based practice. So the idea of evaluating the work that we were doing and making sure that actually the things that we were doing were producing the results that we wanted isn't at all, unfamiliar to psychology. So QI seemed to be the way we could do that and get support in doing it as well. So the model of improvement was helpful to us because our QI facilitator was helping us to identify where the barriers were to having a more representative workforce, where we thought the barriers were, particularly at this stage in people's career. And so that enabled us to identify that it was really firstly at recruitment that we were not getting a fully representative group of people even applying for our positions. Because it's so competitive, your application form needs to give all of the right information in the right level of detail so that the shortlisters can actually pull you through to adverts. So that was one of our first drivers. And then we were also identifying that when people came to interview, if we were not thinking carefully enough about our interview questions, we were asking them about experiences perhaps that they hadn't had. So you almost needed to have done the job to be able to interview well for the job. So we tried to think about some interview questions that would enable people to use their ordinary life experiences to showcase their skills of perhaps being able to reflect on situations in their life that had psychological relevance, to be able to talk about what they'd learned from their degree and how that applied to society and the difficulties that people with mental health problems might have. And the third thing was we needed to create the sorts of placements that in a short period of time, because our HE funding was going to give people a 12-week placement. So in that short period of time, we needed to enable them to garner all the skills that they could do, really, so that when they went to another recruitment process, they'd be able to make the most of that and be successfully recruited to a paid position. So we looked at the PDSA cycle, the Plan, Do, Study, Act cycle. And I suppose one of the things we were thinking about particularly was advertising. So we considered the fact that do people always know what they should be putting on an application form, for example? And then we had a group of assistant psychologists and student psychologists working with us produced a webinar which was used with our internal secondment advert. And later we interviewed people to see if they'd watched the video and what they'd used from the video in thinking about making their written application. And that was quite well endorsed, really, that people found the video, the webinar, quite useful in thinking about how they should structure an application, what information they needed to put. So that was one of them. The interview process was another, and we were thinking about our interview questions, and we went back to candidates, both our unsuccessful candidates who weren't shortlisted for interview, people who did get an interview, and people who were offered a placement. So we checked out all of the assumptions that we were making about what would be helpful and what would encourage people from underrepresented characteristics or backgrounds to be successful in the project. We checked out whether they felt it had helped them in the end. So I think in the sense that did COVID affect the project particularly? Probably not. But what COVID had done was it had made us more familiar with using MS Teams, with video calls, with video conferencing. It made the whole process of producing that webinar easier because perhaps we were more familiar with using those things, whereas perhaps previously we would never have done those things. Equality, diversity and inclusion is really the reason we were doing this project, to get a more representative workforce in the future amongst clinical psychologists. And that's really critical because our service users don't all come from the same background. They come from all walks of life, from all cultures. They've had a variety of different life experiences, and they've grown up with different cultural assumptions and values as a result of that. And when we have a lack of diversity in our workforce, we're not well placed to provide services for people who come from more diverse backgrounds. We can inadvertently miss the nuance of something. We could necessarily not design a service that would meet people's needs or take account of the barriers that might be there for people in accessing our services, or that might actually just prevent them from having the best quality experience that they can have and the best clinical outcomes. So diversity in the workforce is critical, really, to being able to meet our service users' needs in a good way. So as I said, psychologists are quite familiar with service evaluation, but one of the unique things about quality improvement processes is drawing up that driver diagram. And I must admit, I did find that quite interesting and very valuable, really, because it allowed us to map out and put down on paper all of the complexities of what was underlying this single problem of the lack of diversity, really, and why were we not successfully recruiting more diverse candidates to our AP posts. So when we got the driver diagram down, yes, there were only 3 primary drivers, but there were then about 9 secondary drivers. There were multiples and multiples of other drivers that were all underlying the problem. And so it was a very visual and a very simple way of actually explaining a very complex problem. So we've completed our first round of recruitment. We were successful in recruiting 5 candidates to 5 different placements, and we were able to ensure that every candidate had at least one characteristic of underrepresentation that we'd identified within our workforce. Candidates had a really good positive experience, and some of them have gone on to get other jobs now in psychologically relevant fields. And so now we're in phase 2. We've got a second amount of funding from Health Education England, and there are going to be, I think, up to 9 placements throughout the trust again. And psychologists are welcome to come forward and let Carl Harris actually know, who's taking on the lead for the project from me, if they would like to host a placement between January and March. So So I've changed my role recently. I'm now actually working as clinical director for specialty. So quality improvement is my job, really, isn't it? That's what I'm there for. I'm there to make sure that our services are getting what they need to produce the best quality experience for service users, the best quality clinical outcomes, and that actually we have a happy workforce as well. So that's what quality improvement means to me. It's really good to have the support of the quality improvement team because they kept us on track. There's a lot of competing demands in your clinical practice, and so it's easy to maybe let a project slip for a little while, but Tabs was great, kept coming back to myself and the team who were working on that to really kind of nudge us and say, have you done this yet? And a special thanks as well to the student who was working with me on the project, whose name was Molly Webster. So she really put a lot into it and it was a great success.